Yes.
Done.
Listo. All right. Buenas
Yes,
tardes. Bienvenidos todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en esta última sesión de la serie Los ecólogos de Krebs, la regulación de poblaciones. En esta serie de seminarios hemos tenido una serie de charlas muy variadas, muy interesantes. Estamos muy contentos porque han tenido un gran impacto. Les comento que se han visto 60,000 veces, si las sumamos todas las charlas de los diferentes científicos. Y estamos muy contentos de tener el día de hoy, pues, esta conversación en donde habrá una síntesis, las conclusiones y una conversación con varios ecólogos de México y de Latinoamérica. Welcome everyone and thank you for joining. Today we have our last seminar of the series Krebs Ecologist on Population Regulation. We are extremely excited with the outcome of the series. To this date, the seminars have been reproduced over 60,000 times. We had people attending from many countries from North, Central, and South America, and from Europe. And we had great comments and congratulations to the speakers. As we have explained several times, population ecology is critical to conservation, to management, and to restoration of biodiversity. And this is why this series has been very important. We have learned from our speakers the importance of field experimental ecology and long-term studies, and we have been very fortunate to review their lifetime research in a brief presentation. For this, we are truly indebted. Many thanks to all of you, Charlie, Judy, Stan, Rudy, and Tony. The format today is different. We will have a brief synthesis and conclusions from our 5 guest speakers. And then we will have questions from a panel of ecologists, which in different ways, their research relates to several of the themes that our Canadian colleagues have presented. I'm very excited too to present our panel of ecologists that will make the questions or comments. Jorge Soberón from Kansas University, former executive director of Conavio. Rodolfo Dirzo, professor at Stanford University and a great colleague also of Conavio. Ángela Cuervo, originally from Colombia and now in Mexico at Conavio too. Mauricio Lima, professor from the Catholic University of Chile. And Franz Mora, researcher at Conavio. They all are truly outstanding researchers with different approaches, but with themes that are close to population ecology and applied ecology, conservation, and climate change. So thank you very much. I will share my screen to let the speakers present their conclusions. Is my screen there?
Yes.
Let's see. Okay. Can you all see the PowerPoint presentation?
You can, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the first one is just the presentation of where are we right now and who is with us. And I will
Carlos,
first see.
sorry, I think you're in speaker mode. Estamos viendo el modo de presentación, se ven.
A ver cómo.
Cuando le piques ahí, dale. En esos 3 botoncitos que están al abajito de la diapositiva,
Ajá.
dile ocultar modo de presentación.
¿Listo?
No.
Carlos, hazlo como presentación de PowerPoint, con ese botoncito que ibas a picar abajo a la derecha.
Ajá, es lo que estoy. Pues no lo hace por alguna razón.
Porque yo supongo que cuando compartes te daba la opción de elegir una pantalla, entonces elige dónde está tu PowerPoint.
Déjame salirme otra vez.
Sí, pero...
voy a dejar de compartir.
Comparte el PowerPoint, no el screen.
Aquí está. Presentación de PowerPoint. A ver, ahí está. A
Ahora
ver.
sí.
¿Ahora sí estoy?
Sí.
All
Se ve
right.
chiquita.
Chiquita, ahí está.
La única cosa, Carlos, que se ve en una versión muy reducida, no llena la pantalla.
Qué raro. ¿Dónde está Sardiel? ¿Está ahí?
Déjalo así y ya se ve muy bien.
Ok. Porque no me la abre desde acá, no sé por qué. Pero bueno, ahí nos vamos. Sardiel, tú puedes arreglar el centro, ¿no? Ok, entonces, then we have first Charlie Krebs. He gave 2 seminars, the population regulation, general theory and history. And then he talked about the ecology of small mammals, 60 years of studying population cycles. And Charlie, the screen, I guess the screen is yours. This is your summary.
Oh, thank you, Carlos. I hope you can all hear me. I have 2 slides I wanted to share with you. And first of all, I want to thank Carlos for arranging this and thank all of the people who are collaborating here. One of the strong things that we have felt over all the years is none of us are infinitely wise. We discuss everything. We discuss ways of testing hypotheses, and we admit when we have made a mistake when we get data to show otherwise. So that has been our really approach at the University of British Columbia and many other places, of course, around the world. I leave you with a few thoughts from my talk. First of all, as Carlos has said, robust population ecology is necessary for conservation. We cannot get along without it, and we have to do it properly and in a manner which we have learned over the years to become more and more precise. The second thing we have learned is that populations change. They're always changing, and we need to understand the mechanisms causing the change. So we have always been interested in mechanistic ecology. If something is happening, if climate change is doing something, we want to know what exactly it's doing and also what we might be able to do about it. And the third message I would like to leave you with in my first talk really is just to monitor. We do not monitor enough. Monitoring is not appreciated enough. It is not funded enough. And yet all of the series, the time series that we are concerned with now, whether they have to do with climate change or fisheries or whatever, all rely on a set of monitoring data, which over the years has gotten more and more precise, but we need to continue it, and we need to have long time series to really see what's happening out there in the real world. Next slide, please, Carlos. My lemming and vole population talk, I think, again, just followed along these lines, and I leave you with 2 relatively simple messages, and that is that the 3 to 4 year cycles of voles and lemmings, they continue unabated in north temperate and polar areas in the northern hemisphere, and there has been discussion about these are disappearing, and newspaper reports of how everything is dying out, and that is complete nonsense. They go on and on and on. So far, and all you can say is so far, that's continuing, and we need study of them. And the second point is, I think, an unappreciated point in many studies of rodents, voles and lemmings in particular, and that is how much social behavior drives population dynamics. There is no question that there are top-down and bottoms-up forces going between food supply, predation, and disease, but social behavior sits in the middle, and all of these have to be considered. And so you cannot simply study food supply and think you have understood everything that voles, lemmings, and other rodents are up to. Social behavior is difficult to study, particularly in field populations, and I think it's been less studied than it should have been. So those are the messages I would leave you with from my talks. Thank you, Carlos. I'm happy to discuss any of this, of course, later on.
Thank you, Charlie. I put next the talk of Rudy Boonstra, who was about population consequences of chronic stress in mammals. He named it Population Regulation and Cycles, a window into natural processes. And it relates very much to the different cycles. So here is Rudy Boonstra.
Okay, I think a really critical question with respect to population regulation is what keeps populations within limits. Stable populations are studied, but I've studied, and Charlie as well, and Stan have studied voles and lemmings and snowshoe hares. The voles and lemmings go to 3 to 4 year cycles in numbers, and snowshoe hares go through 9 to 11 year cycles. I think the enigma in these cycles, and if we understand the enigma, we'll understand the nature of the cycle. That's my proposal, that what is the memory that causes the circle that I have called the low phase. Here you see examples from meadow voles in southern Ontario, which I studied over about 5 years. And you can see it there in red. On the other side, you see the snowshoe hare example, a long period of low numbers. So that's an enigma. And the question is, it seems to be a memory in these populations. If you bring animals from different phases, either the voles or the snowshoe hares into the lab, they behave in ways in terms of reproduction in the same way that they do in the field. So the critical question is, what is the basis of the memory which determines the low phase? Next slide, please. Okay, at the very top, it's a non-population ecology picture, but it deals with the World War II and the Enigma machine. So there's a parallel there. The supreme commander of the Allied forces, Dwight Eisenhower, said that the military intelligence to obtain the cracking of the Enigma machine was absolutely decisive in the Allied victory. And I would argue the same way, that understanding the low phase will give us insight, not only insight, it will crack the cycle. So the really critical question is, what are the necessary and sufficient mechanisms to explain the low phase and in summary, the overall cycle? Okay, if we take a look at voles and lemmings, I echo what Charlie just said. In voles and lemmings, the key player in all of this are the females. They're territorial, they engage in social behavior during the peak. And that sets the stage for the decline in the low phase. You have to understand a bit about the biology of voles. If you breed one summer, you're dead by the next. It's only your offspring which are alive. So the offspring, and particularly at the peak, they don't breed typically, or they don't breed much. They have to hang around to the decline, and then they breed. So the question is, what's going on with these young animals which have to wait almost the better part of a year before they breed? In the case of the snowshoe hare, it's not social behavior at all. It's direct and indirect effects of predation, which occur during the peak and decline. And I argue that both of these have maternal effects on the offspring, and that essentially changes the epigenetic signature of the offspring. Essentially, it doesn't modify the DNA directly, but it modifies the expression of the DNA. Both of these ultimately reduce offspring survival and reproduction. So I think the key thing is to study epigenetics in both of these during that phase, during the peak and decline and the increase as well. What's going on? Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Rudy. Then we had Judy Myers. She talked about applied population ecology, biological control of weeds and insects first. And then she also talked about nature's 10-year cycles, the cyclic dynamics of forest caterpillars. And from that, we move from the mammals to the world of insects and plants. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Carlos. I thought I would start with this quote by a colleague, Tom Miller, who's at Rice University in Texas. If nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution, one could argue that nothing in ecology or evolution makes sense except in light of population dynamics. And I think this is why I feel that population ecology is so exciting and essential for understanding what's happening in nature, and then going back to, if we ever have a hope of controlling pests or of conserving animals and plants, we have to know what is happening at the population dynamic level. And so, I think studying physiology is great, but if you can't relate it to what's happening in the organism's populations, then you're missing a big part of the puzzle. Next slide, please. So to go back and review what I talked about during my talks, in regard to the cyclic species, we know that there is a requirement for strong density-related mortality, fecundity, and dispersal. And there's a lot of emphasis on the mortality side, on the effect of parasitoids in insect populations, predators in the mammal populations. But you have to know what's happening to the fecundity, and I'll go back to the maternal effects that Rudy just talked about. And you get the same thing with these forest insects, where high densities lead to a reduction in the fecundity. And I think that's crucial for making the dynamics work. That's the lag that is necessary for cyclic dynamics. And finally, dispersal. Dispersal is very difficult to study, and I started my career by studying dispersal in voles. And maybe it was easier in the voles even than the insects, but one of the things that I have come to conclude is that dispersal is very important to these different cyclic species. And that's what keeps them in synchrony, in my view. And that's what allows there to be this genetic similarity amongst populations of the various species that go through cycles. And so I think we really need to think more about dispersal. I also talked about monarch butterfly populations a bit, a species that's near and dear to my heart. And it's quite different from the cyclic species, and it's influenced a lot by strong and variable impacts of the environment and the host plants, and they feed on a variety of different milkweeds. And so we have a very different situation where we have 4 generations a year, and what happens between those breeding populations and then the overwintering populations is crucial to the population dynamics. And there's going to be a lot of variation from year to year. And there's great interest in conserving those populations. And there's maybe not much we can do about the hurricanes that come through Mexico, but saving that overwintering population and trying to save the northern populations of milkweeds is really imperative to that conservation. Finally, biological control, I have always found as being exciting experiments because we're introducing species in hopes of limiting and perhaps regulating weeds and insects. And in this way, I think we can, in addition to doing a lot of monitoring, we can look at what these impacts are in a system that maybe is slightly simpler because we bring in maybe 1 or 2 of these biological control agents at a time. And I will say that one of the things that often are lacking in these experiments are proper controls. And I think through any experiments in population ecology, you have to have controls, and it's very difficult to do this because of the dispersal of the insects moving from one area to the next, but something that must be taken into account. So thank you, Carlos. And where's my tequila, Carlos?
Thank you, Judy. Then Stan Boutin came and talked to us about predator-prey dynamics in Canada's boreal forest, basically the snowshoe hare and lynx cycle, which is so important and has been documented for so long. But he also talked to us a bit about applied ecology, population ecology, and talk about the species conservation in the Anthropocene, time for a change, particularly in the system of caribou, white-tailed deer, and wolves, which was really, really interesting talk. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Carlos. And the switch to the snowshoe hare cycle from the work that that Charlie and Rudy talked about turned out to be really interesting in so many ways. The first question obviously was whether there were similarities between the two types of cycles. These are bull populations versus these hare populations that have much longer periodicities. And I've always viewed, and this was really pushed on me by Dennis Chitty, who mentored so many of us, is that these population cycles just provide these incredibly interesting natural experiments, because how else can one vary density of a population so immensely and study the demographic drivers of that variation, and then on top of that, the mechanisms behind those drivers. And so that's why cycles have always been so neat to me. So different, I think, from what Charlie and Rudy were finding and pushing with the social factors in the vole cycles, is that I think we continually were pushed towards, in the hare cycles, external drivers of what was going on in the system. And in particular, the one that seemed to float to the top was predation, as being such a dominant top-down force in these hare cycles. And I think there's behavior mixed into that, but unlike Charlie and Rudy, I think that behavior is simply related to per capita food supply and how hares can get access to that food. And their ability to do that interacts with predation to drive much of the cycle. So for me, this has been the nicest part of all this, is that we've been working together on this for 40, 50 years, and we still don't agree on many of the components, really stimulating a lot of very good discussion and forcing us all to be better scientists as a result. And I just sort of ended my talk in that some of the most exciting stuff, I think, is coming about with these new technologies involving biologging, where I think we're going to be able to look at predation with even a new lens to get into more detail, because of the very interesting ways we can now probe into what predators are doing as their prey base changes. Next slide, Carlos. This talk was really quite different in a sense. It was about caribou as a case study, but what I tried to emphasize is that the example I show with caribou is, I think, occurring much more frequently for many species of interest, and conservation is in many cases about special cases for various species, and caribou is just one special case. And it's a nice example of what we call this apparent competition. Changing climate and our activities have really upset this system and led to predation being a much bigger driver on caribou than it was in the past, and these characters simply can't cope with that. To recover these populations, though, that's the big rub in my view, and it really, my experience with this system, with this large organism that ranges over big areas, is we just have to stop thinking that we can recover these populations by protecting areas and recovering their habitat. It's just too little, too late for that. And as a consequence, our only options are highly aggressive interventions, and probably in the long run, interventions that mean we need to do this forever and ever if we want to keep them around. So my last slide then is a more general issue, is that these changes that are taking place in the Anthropocene, because of us dominating the system, because of climate changing, means we really have to think carefully about how we should plan for conservation in the future. And I sort of leave three things that I think are debatable, but I'm sort of pushing fairly strong ideas. And I hope that these sorts of ideas may come out later in the discussion as to what we may do in the future for conservation of species. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you, Stan. And finally, we had Tony Sinclair talking about a place like no other, discovering the secrets of Serengeti. And thank you, Tony, for joining. Here is your summary.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. You might wonder why I use that title. It happens to be the title that Princeton forced me to use for the title of our book that's coming out in September. When I first went to Serengeti over 50 years ago, I was so struck by it that it forced me to ask the question, why is it Serengeti so different from anywhere else in the world? And the other side of the coin, what causes other places not to be like Serengeti? So what are the rules that cause the Serengeti to persist? And over time, we were able to almost stepwise figure out the different rules or principles that regulated the system. So jumping to that summary, in essence, there is one fundamental principle of regulation in an ecosystem caused by changes in death and birth rates. If the populations are too high, survival goes down. If the population's too low, survival goes up. As a result of that, we have an equilibrium, which is a mathematical necessity, it's a logical necessity, but is usually never visible. Disturbance is the reason for that, because these stochastic, that is, non-predictable fluctuations in the environment, largely through weather, but not always, especially in marine and aquatic systems, these disturbances push the populations, the species off that equilibrium, and regulation brings them back again. Regulation itself can be caused by a lack of resources, food, space, habitat, and so on. And we call that bottom-up regulation. Next one, Carlos. Regulation can be caused by predators or disease. That's top-down regulation. And in fact, we can have combinations of both of those taking place. Migration is a way of populations jumping from predator regulation to bottom-up regulation and results in very large numbers. And that basically applies to all populations, all migratory populations in the world. Long-term environmental change, which is through climate, causes ecosystems to change. The envelope that Stan was just talking about just now. And it means then that populations have to change this, the equilibrium is changing, and the populations have to track that. And finally, if systems change too much, they then may jump quite quickly to a configuration of different species, which we would call a different stable state. And what that means is that ecosystems have several different equilibria. Next one. Thank you. So these rules apply to all ecosystems. And most of the I will rephrase, all of the problems in ecosystems that we get in the world are due to an abuse of at least one of those rules. Now, I don't have time to go into all of that, but we can interfere with regulation, and that changes density dependence into inverse density dependence. Bottom up, it can be abused by supplementing food or removing food and habitat. Top down, by removing predators, usually on continents, or adding in predators that are not wanted on islands. Biodiversity is one of the features that I haven't talked about, but contribute to the resilience of a system. And if you lose those species, such as keystones, or indeed if you just lose too many species, then the system becomes unstable. Migration can be abused by preventing the migration, and then you have a collapse of the ecosystem. Slow change, if you prevent that from taking place, and Stan just referred to that, so I won't say any more than that, other than that will cause a collapse of the system too, if you try and prevent that slow change from taking place. And multiple states, if humans abuse systems too much, they can flip into a different state, and those states could be undesirable, and maybe we can't even get out of them again. So I don't have time to go into any more of the details of that, but in essence, that's what comes out of this 55 years of study. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to stop sharing. Well, this is an amazing banquet. It's a big plate, and it reminds me of what Dan Simberloff said once, that good community ecology begins with good population ecology. So it is a huge lesson on population and community ecology. Thank you, it's great. And I'm going to ask Jorge Soberón to begin with a first question. You can answer the questions if he selects any of you, but if you have any other one has anything to add, please feel free. Thank you, Jorge.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for your excellent presentations. I really enjoy them. And thanks, Carlos, for organizing this symposium. I have a lot of questions, and I really would like to have time to explore some of them, but I'm going to stick to one which I hope will be sort of provocative enough or contentious enough. Most of what you guys have said, or it's implied in the way you presented it, is predicated on that phrase that Judy put in the screen, that nothing in ecology or in evolution makes sense but on the light of population ecology. And to a certain degree, I agree. However, population ecology is not the population ecology of one species or two or three. Very quickly, you get into community ecology. And my question is, how do you move from the theory of population ecology, which is one or two, maybe three species, if you push it, with data for one, maybe two, seldom three, if you push it, to an ensemble of many species? How do you move from population ecology to community ecology, as Carlos said? That's my question.
Thank you, Jorge. And we can start with that one before we go into another one. So if anyone, Stan Boutin, wants to answer.
So we tried to take baby steps with our boreal forest system when we were studying the hair cycle, by at least looking at all of the mammalian players in the system and the plants that were related to snowshoe hares. But you're quite right, is, we got peripheral information on these other players. We had no details on any of the demographic mechanisms. We just had population change. And so it quickly deteriorates away, that you can't get at too many of these altogether. And so I guess one way is always taking what you think are maybe dominant players in the system, or you get pushed to dealing with the players that society is most interested in. And otherwise, you really just can't get around it because the costs are so high. And I don't even think you people might want to comment in this, but these long-term ecological monitoring sites that the US has pushed, at least, in that, I think is an attempt to get around this, but I don't really see them doing anything all that exciting along this line, moving population dynamics into the community realm. But maybe people disagree there.
Charlie.
Let me follow on from that. I think it's an excellent question, and what Stan has said is essentially right. That is to say, you got to get hold of the food web. Okay, the food web, which is what we try to do in our Yukon studies. You must do that for any community. And what that means automatically from what follows from what Stan said is you have to throw away probably most of the species in the community. They are completely meaningless. Okay, we love them all. We love this little butterfly that there's only two left of in our study area. We love it very much, but we can't do anything about it. We have to worry about the big guys, if you like, the big guys in terms of energy flow and in terms of what we can cope with our budgets. So I think that's really crucial. And we don't like to say that. I guess if I wrote a paper that said, throw away most of those species, we don't give a damn about them. That is, ecologically, we can't possibly do it. It's like trying to have an army fight a war with one rifle or something. It's impossible. So we take the big guys and try to make a story out of that. And I think that's hard enough. It's very difficult. Community ecology is, I think, impossible in my old age. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Charlie.
Can I offer a suggestion? If you do comparative work, so we have the 10-year cycle dominates the boreal forest of North America. That doesn't happen in northwestern Europe. There, the cycle is dominated by small mammals and weasels. So if you take the comparative approach, that can help you understand what the basis of the community is. So I think that's a sort of an antecedent. We know what our system, how it works by and large. They know how their system works, but what is the basis of the system? So I would suggest that part of the solution as well, if you have these two different areas at the same latitude, to do comparative. And the conclusion from that work that we did as a big group was that the central driver of these two different communities was in fact climate. It's bottom up, which was in some sense counterintuitive. But I would suggest that one of the ways to approach this, if you can, is do comparative work in addition to doing experiments and basically monitoring.
Thank you, Rudy. Well, we go to Rodolfo to pose a question.
Okay, Carlos, thank you so much. It's great to be with this set of heroes here in front of us. It is a terrific opportunity, and I'm so honored and happy to be with you this afternoon. I do know that we're emphasizing Charlie's ecologists, but I want to say before I ask my question that in addition to his tremendous legacy in the area of research in ecology population dynamics, he has had a tremendous contribution also in terms of education. In my classes of ecology, I love to use always the principle that he used in his previous books of ecology, which is the study of the analysis of distribution and abundance of the species. That to me is a fantastic definition of ecology, which I always use in my classes. And then when you begin to sort of tease apart what is behind that approach, is so informative and so crucial, and so many generations have benefited from that. So Charlie, thank you for that contribution as well. Now, for my question, for my comment, one thing that we have learned with this fantastic set of presentations is that change is the norm. Change is there all the time in space and time. And we've seen wonderful examples of those changes in space and time. We've learned also about the drivers. Sometimes they can be bottom up, sometimes they can be top down. And sometimes, and we have seen beautiful illustrations of that, the situation is much more complicated because it's not only a question of defining what is the relative importance of one or the other, but also the combination of the two. That's fantastic. But on top of that, there are other drivers of change, which is anthropogenic change. Humans messing up with these complex spatial-temporal variations and the regulators of those dynamics. So what I have seen or what I have gathered from what you have presented is that in this complex situation of the normal spatial-temporal dynamics, the imposition or the superposition, juxtaposition, sorry, of anthropogenic impact, there's going to be some losers and some winners. Losers, for example, Stan said, we need to let go of some populations. So my question is, can we say something at this stage which are going to be which are likely to be the winners and which ones are likely to be the losers? I am imagining by what Charlie have been saying that the losers are going to be the medium and large animals that run the world, according to some visions. But how can we actually come to define or predict or get some guidance as to what can we expect about which ones are going to be the winners and losers, either in terms of life histories, in terms of taxonomic affiliations, and then finally, what would be the community consequences of that? Coming back a little bit to Jorge's question. So the question of winners and losers and the repercussions of that at sort of the broader level of the community. Thank you.
Well, I might jump in here and say, I always tell my students it's going to be the cockroaches that are going to be the winners over a long time. But I do think the insects, they've got a lot of characteristics that are going to help them deal with these anthropogenic changes. Some of that has to do with the fact that they can move great distances from one place to another. And certainly some of them are very rare normally, and they're going to drop out. But I think that insects are going to be winners.
Yeah, but Judy, remember that insects are also declining dramatically, and it seems to me that not all of them are declining equally.
That's right, and you know, there've been a number of papers out recently about insect decline, and in fact, taking some of the particular papers and showing that the statistical analysis sometimes doesn't back up the very high profile comments about declines in insects. So I think that's an area that needs a lot more work, that meta-population studies aren't going to do it, because each one of those studies really has to be looked at very carefully. I mean, did the monitoring start when the population was high and therefore it's bound to be declining? What is the relationship between the different study areas? What types of trapping are used? I think we got to be a little careful on just saying that the insects are declining very dramatically. Sure, everything's going to decline because humans are destroying so much of the habitat, or changing the habitat into different types of biology. But I'm not going to be overly pessimistic yet.
But couldn't we start with sort of a simple rule that certainly let's take specialists and call them habitat specialists. They probably are maybe vulnerable, and in particular, if they happen to have habitats that reside right where we as humans want to do whatever we do, they're going to be in the toughest shape. And then you go to the next one. If we exploit the hell out of the populations because we like to consume them, they're going to be next on the list. And I think there are some fairly easy ways we can walk down that list to know which species are going to be in trouble, and probably check quite a few of them off. And then on the opposite side, I think, as Judy points out, those organisms that are highly flexible and seem to be able to handle human-dominated sorts of environments are going to do extremely well.
Thank you, Stan. Charlie?
Yeah, I think, Rodolfo, that's an excellent question. And I think that we decide what's going to make it into the next century. And I think it is the big guys. The big guys, we decide, which stands, I think, qualifications on it. But it's really up to us, go to New Zealand where they put a fence around an area and say, keep the rats out or whatever. And then we can keep our lovely ground-dwelling birds. We're going to make decisions like that. So ecology then moves into economics and says, what can we afford to keep? What can Mexico afford to keep that it really wants to? So on the one hand, you get the public to say, we like monarch butterflies, we like whatever, birds, and what can we do to keep them? But we'll let other ones go that are impossible to save because we decide that ecologically, or they're impossible to save because they'll cost more money than the US Army.
I think Rudy, yes, Rudy.
I think the problem that I see with terms of predicting where we're going is that we've got multiple factors, or at least a number of big factors changing simultaneously. And the elephant in the room is climate change. In terms of its impact on the vegetation, its impact on all sorts of aspects. So you've got multiple changes going on simultaneously, and that's a major issue. How does the warming climate affect the secondary plant compounds? How does it affect survival? How does it affect the snowfall of the predator, affecting the predators, and all of those things? So I think we were really fortunate in the Yukon that by and large, well, we think it by and large, it was a relatively pristine system, but we're seeing changes now. So I think that's the problem. It's not like a laboratory where you can control everything. We can't. And so I think we're in a dilemma there.
Thank you, Rudy. I think that opens the time for Ángela who has been chasing that elephant in the room.
Hi, thank you. Well, first I want to thank you all because I know these lectures will be very, very useful for all young researchers in Latin America. This is a great effort of Conavio of coming, uniting on inviting you to do these great seminars. So thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos, obviously. And I want to return a little bit to the question, to the issue that Rodolfo mentioned. And there is considerable debate about the potential to attribute ecological changes to climate change. And mainly perhaps because other factors such as land use and management have also driven these changes, no? That could be driven these changes. So my question is a very general question that maybe you can help us young researchers to give us some recommendations on how to disentangle these impacts of climate change from other factors in population ecology. Really.
Thank you, Angela. How to disentangle climate change from other factors?
Excellent question.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head as a good start is don't go down that single road to start with. Consider that there are always alternatives and try and take that into consideration before you get started. And I think that's a real concern with some of the students coming in as they get set on one issue and that is the only issue worth pursuing.
Charlie?
Well, I think, Angela, the physiologists have the best way to get at this. I mean, looking at the species distribution modeling, largely based on the belief that all of this is driven by climate, you know, which may or may not be true, and it's probably not true, but for a lot of species, maybe close enough. And you can look at, you know, chances that corals or whatever can tolerate higher temperatures or lower temperatures or whatever. So you can do a lot of this in the lab. Now, in the real world, of course, you can't do that except by time series of any area where the climate is changing. And the northern Canada is one of those areas. And there are lots of others, I'm sure. So I think the only really way to get at this is probably at the physiological level and maybe with some genetics thrown in. But certainly that's not my area of expertise.
Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, Carlos?
Yes, Tony?
If you don't mind, can I say something?
You can say it.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to address Jorg's question first. How do you move from population to community ecology? And I think really that's an on question because you cannot do population ecology without community ecology. Populations do not occur on their own. And so basically all you do, and it's a simple answer, you expand it to everything else there is to study. I didn't have time to talk about all of that in the Serengeti, but essentially we did. We've studied just about everything there is possible to study, including the microbes. So it's relative, essentially there is no distinction between the two. Talking about Rodolfo's question, I wasn't quite clear what the question was, whether the question was which species are going to go to, can we predict which species will go extinct, or which species are we supposed to be trying to save?
The question was,
sorry,
go on. The question was, given anthropogenic impact on top of the spatio-temporal variation in the dynamics of animals, I believe that some species are going to go, or populations are going to go extinct and some others are going to win. Can we predict what attributes will one group or the other group will have? And then what consequences might that have on the structure of the community and the functioning of the system?
So just again, are you saying which species are going to go extinct? Is that right?
Or populations, because I think that...
Yeah, okay, which populations?
Yeah.
Well, if I was to answer that for Africa, I would say by the end of this century, there will be no mammal populations left in Africa other than domestic. That has been predicted by a number of different people, and I think it's correct. That has enormous consequences of how we conduct conservation. And that's why I'm focusing on rewilding. And particularly things like zoos and DNA reconstruction and all of those things I see as our last line of defense. As to exactly which species are going to go, I think it's who knows.
Yeah.
But if you're asking, what should we be focused on trying to preserve? I know a lot of people immediately jump in and say keystones. But the problem with keystones is it's a conundrum. It's a logical conundrum because you can't actually identify a keystone until after you've identified it, which is too late. We can't do all our studies before we do our conservation. We have to do our conservation in the hope that we got the right one. So my answer to that is you don't try and do things on that basis. What we're going to try to do is maintain the original trophic cascade as best we can. Now, we can't keep everything in there, but as Charlie said, not everything is playing a big role. I think one should remember, though, that the rivet hypothesis, which says that if you lose too many, even little species, then things will start to unravel.
Yeah.
And, oh dear, Angela, remind me.
That was a climate question.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm not sure whether I understood Stan, but my answer is I don't think we should be distinguishing between anthropogenic climate change and natural climate change. It's going to happen anyway. Don't try and stop it, but instead plan to accept it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. We'll give a chance to Mauricio to ask a question.
Thank you. First of all, thank a lot for the presentation. For a population ecologist and a population dynamicist, have 5 population ecologists together presenting their work is a privilege. And then thank for this opportunity. And more than a question, I would like to have a general question for all of you about the role of population theory, population dynamic theory, and population dynamic studies in the general PhD education of ecologists and people studying for being manager of conservation programs and fisheries, and even the role of population dynamic, the animal population dynamic tradition, which is a long and venerable tradition in ecology, as a tool for impacting some other areas as human demography and social science. I think there is a lack of or a proper knowledge of population of dynamic of organisms, animal population dynamic. Always I talk about the traditional animal population dynamics from the 50s, 60s, and today. This is the two questions. If there is some problem that the new ecologists are not working in population dynamic today as 20, 30 years ago, and if population dynamic have a role, population dynamic for animal ecology have a role to impact other disciplines as human demography and social science, I think.
Thank you, Mauricio. Charlie.
Mauricio, thank you for bringing that up. It allows me to tirade something I keep telling everybody. Population dynamic is successful because it has an arithmetic. There's no other area of ecology that has any arithmetic in it. Community ecology has no arithmetic. They pretend there is, but there isn't the arithmetic we have in population dynamics. And I think that's why, and that's the basis of fisheries management. It's the basis of effective wildlife management. It's the basis of a lot of the modeling which goes on, I think, in ecology, that we have this incredible arithmetic in the broad sense, arithmetic of populations. And so that's why, in part, I think we need to really start at that level and teach people that you need to approach the world, with numbers. I mean, that's been the general theme of science for how many 100 years now. And so I think, in a sense, I back up everything you've said, that the importance of models, numbers, arithmetic, in the broad sense, statistics, which population ecology in the last 50 years has triumphed with.
Thank you, Charlie. Anyone else?
Maybe I'll throw in a little plug for the plant ecology. People maybe are more familiar because the plants are sitting out there and they can look at it, but I think a lot of good work has been done, well, over the years from succession forward on the ecology of plants that make these plant communities what they are today, whether that's forest communities or grasslands or even agricultural crops, where it's important to know the interactions between the species that allow things to thrive.
But do other people get the concern I have that many young ecologists view population ecology as passé? There's nothing new and exciting anymore in population ecology unless you're doing conservation or applied ecology. Then it's all okay. But on the pure population side of things, it's tough to get students excited about it. Am I the only one seeing that or viewing that, or am I just a pessimist, or is that a common feeling among the group?
I think you're exactly right, Stan. Right on.
I think you're right, Stan, but I would say that it extends to natural history, most unfortunately. That is another aspect that has been neglected, and I'm so sorry to see that in modern programs, educational programs at the level of universities and so on. It is very sad, and Charlie brought this up in his presentation. I think natural history is so essential to go into population ecology and beyond, but I think this is unfortunately something that is being diluted so dramatically, and I'm so sorry to see that.
I like to believe that these things come and go, and that population ecology is going to come back again to be the respected science that I think it was when all of us were sort of in our PhD eras. And people are going to maybe realize that the answering community questions, as Charlie said, is so difficult to do. And I think the other thing I see is so many people want to work in the tropics, and that just makes things even more difficult, more species, but they love the tropics.
But the other thing that I see is in terms of the hiring that's going on, at least in Canada, I don't know about the States or Mexico, but the hiring is for evolutionary biologists, which emphasizes evolutionary biologists and people interested in biodiversity. So the whole idea, and these people have a 40-year lifespan like we did. So it's going to be very difficult. By the time these guys are retired and past their best before date, you're looking at, a long period of time. I mean, I see this at the University of Toronto, this sort of hiring pattern, which distresses me to no end, right? We've just lost a great aquatic ecologist, done some really fundamental stuff, David Schindler. But when I posted his obituary, I got absolutely almost no interest in the fundamental things that he did in terms of aquatic ecology and so on. That distresses me enormously in terms of I think emphasizing what Stan said.
Okay, we have Franz Mora to complete the first round of questions. Franz.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much for all these incredible stories. I mean, these are life stories. To see all this work in terms of monitoring for decades is amazing. I think the real value of all your contribution is to this life dedicated to some topic in ecology. I think is amazing. And there are several really good messages to take home. And probably the one that I will take with me home is to realize and confirm that predators play a very important role in population top-down regulation, and also directly by maintaining ecological integrity of ecosystems. The implications of having good populations and good interactions between these populations really has strong impacts on the way that ecosystems function. But in order to maintain this interaction and maintaining the ecological role of predators, it requires a lot of space. I mean, we are talking about huge amounts of space to maintain this ecological role. My question is, in your experience and looking at all these changes and the dynamics of the interactions between populations, what would be the best strategy for preserving predator-prey interactions in a human-modified environment? Basically, we have a new age in which ecological processes are changing. We are talking about novel ecosystems now. And are the interventions that Stan are talking about are here definitely to stay? Or what other strategies we should take into consideration in terms of practicality of applying or trying to apply in practical terms of this knowledge that we have now, especially when there are few efforts to have or to create more conservation areas, and the coexistence with predators is really, really difficult now these days.
Thank you, Franz. And the next question is?
That question's too hard.
Well, maybe I'll start a bit. Is just, you know, the power of these big protected areas like Serengeti, which is always under assault, I think, and as Tony's pointing out, maybe get swallowed up over time just because of human growth, etc. as well. But those big systems are just so invaluable to have any chance of maintaining that type of dynamic of predator-prey interactions that operate at such big scales. Lots of other places will have those dynamics go on, but the players will probably look quite different. But as long as the things we do still maintain populations that can be consumed by these predators, there will be some predators around. But again, back to the harvest mode, you know, the folly that we think we can take these sorts of levels of harvest out of all of these systems without having enormous repercussions to the competitors, the other predators in the system, is just craziness. It just can't continue. And yet we continue merrily on our way to in fact do that.
I was thinking a bit of the example of the wolves in Europe, France, where France, Italy, Spain have populations of wolves that have increased from the 1970s, in spite of the fact that they are in very very modified landscapes. So maybe we should look at those examples, no, where they have been able to share the space with predators.
Yeah, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that these interactions are necessary for healthy ecosystems, and as ecological processes that are continuing to be occurring. We have now leopards hunting domestic dogs in India, for example. So thinking about preserving ecological processes only in conservation areas, I think it's not going to happen in the future. We have anthropogenic ecosystems, we have highly impacted ecosystems, and we need to keep these interactions. So I know it's a really hard question. Sorry, Judy, but but it's the things that we have to be thinking about as ecologists in the future. We have no longer natural areas to study this kind of interactions, and probably we should take a new look on how these interactions are going to be modified and are in fact modified by human presence.
Isn't the other elephant in the room the human population growth and the inability of population ecologists over the years to try to convince people that growth cannot continue, whether it's economic growth or human population growth. And really that's what's changing all of these systems that we're talking about. But people don't like to talk about that. It's not politically acceptable.
Brian, if I may, Franz, I think that that question is extremely important question that you have. There is no way we're going to be able to maintain all of these processes inside protected areas. We're going to have to accept these processes outside of protected areas, as you were implying. And I was sort of ending in my talk that really we have to start thinking about making those human-dominated areas more biodiversity friendly, making them more suitable for the trophic cascades that you're talking about. But there is one enormous problem, which is we have no idea whether they're going to be sustainable, whether they are not on a collision course for catastrophe. And
Exactly.
we can point to many, many examples where we thought everything was stable. You know, some years ago, I had a debate with some economists from Washington, DC, and they just said, listen, you can get rid of most of your biodiversity. Look at agriculture in Europe. That's been perfectly stable since the Middle Ages or something like that, of course. Little did we know that every single species of bird, almost every single species of bird in Britain is now on a collapse to extinction. Vast numbers of insects in Germany are on a collapse to extinction. There is lots of evidence to suggest that things are not stable. So how do we deal with this? And the only way is the standard scientific approach is to have control areas where you compare what's going on outside with what's going on inside protected areas. So it's absolutely essential to have baselines, and that's where the protected areas come in. But the purpose of it is to try and generate sustainable systems outside.
Thank you, Tony. We can, well, before we go to the next round, I'd like to let you know that we have people congratulating you from Argentina, from Guatemala, from many states of Mexico, and they are all really happy about the impact of the seminars. I think there is a lot of messages to take home and to think about. I'd like to continue a second round of questions with Jorge. If you have another question.
Sure, I do. And what I am going to try is to link it with things that have been said and also my original concern. The question I have for all of you is, how do you see the shape of theory in population ecology in the future? And I ask this question because I have been reading a lot of papers where people claim that it's big data nowadays and we are beyond theory and we don't need the ideas and we don't need, well, theory, understanding. It's just a matter of gathering data using AI methods. So how do you see the shape of theory in ecology? More like Lotka-Volterra equations, or more like, I'm going to use the word blind artificial intelligence? People are claiming that that's the future. I would like to hear your opinions and link that to the fact that we are also now witnessing much more so-called citizen science, including the use of automated systems to gather information, so that monitor that Dr. Krebs was referring to. Now maybe it's being done by non-scientists. Is that reliable? Can we trust that?
Charlie.
Thanks, Jorge. I distinguish political monitoring from scientific monitoring. An awful lot of the monitoring going on now is, in my humble opinion, as my wife would say, completely useless. It's my opinion, but it's a very good political thing to have going, because people love birds and they love to pile up records of them and so on, and they may be of some use in the future, but I doubt that they will be very useful for solving the problems that we face, that Tony has allotted to, and others of you. So I think we have to have proper monitoring. And now artificial intelligence, big data. Now, sorry, I am not a fan, and so I will shut up. I am too old, and Judy will start yelling at me. One of the things we have always allowed at UBC is to have our students can yell at us all we like, and we fight all the time about issues, and we don't feel bad about that. We have different opinions, but I'm not a fan of big data. Let's say there's a tiny bit of science that might be useful, big data might be useful for, but I think it's none of the important questions we face.
Okay, I'll jump in there. I do think that anything that involves a broad proportion of the human population in looking at plants and animals has got to be good. We talked a little bit about this, the lack of natural history. You know, biodiversity might not be natural history in how species are interacting, but if you know what those species are, and that's got to be the basis of biodiversity, that is a good thing in my view. The other thing about big data, yeah, there's probably a lot of nonsense that's going on, but we have cumulatively spent a whole bunch of time out there collecting data on our species in our areas. And unless this is used in a broader sense to find out what general principles are, it's not nearly as valuable as it could be. So I think that there are types of big data analyses that are global, and it can tell us interesting things, but you've got to be careful because the sample sizes are so large, the statistics are so potentially iffy.
But Judy, do you think that is where the advance will be with big data? Will be giving us an understanding of the generality of the basic things that we have already discovered, or that it will reveal some undiscovered relationships that will just set us on a brand new path? Because I think that the latter is what often big data people are pushing, and I just cannot see that. But maybe your other element of seeking this generality with these broad data sets might be a way to go.
Yeah, that's what I would say, that generality has got to be helpful. But you've got to push it through too, that you don't just go out there and you know, take pictures of what the effect of the human population is on animals that go past camera traps. You know, you've got to go back to this, what we've talked about through this whole thing, about what's it doing to the populations of those animals or plants.
But the other sort of fear, and maybe I'm going to antagonize some people, but an example of big data that's going to come out in the next little while is that everybody's jumped on the camera bandwagon to see how animals have changed their movements given COVID or whatever. Yeah. And the amazing outcome is going to be animals have changed their movements because there are fewer humans out there doing things. And that's going to be in science and nature. And that's an example of big data, how insightful that has been. And I just look at it and sort of say, my God, is that that's what we've come to in all of this. But I don't find the question interesting, nor the data analysis interesting, but maybe I'm biased.
But I think that is a very narrow, I don't even know if I would call that big data, but yeah.
No, it's not big. I mean, the definition of big data means that you need a truck with hard drives to move the data around. You can download it, it's not big data. But people call it big data. People call that kind of thing big data. It's in, I mean, I was quoting from a paper in Ecology saying that the end of theory for ecology is already here because of AI and big data.
I think it's important to understand what we're trying to do here with big data. Big data is basically asking questions that are how questions. How do you do that? How do you analyze all of these data? How do you collect all of these data? How do you analyze them? And you get patterns out of them. But that's how questions, how you do it. That's technology. That's not science. Science is why questions. All of that big data analysis begs the question, so what? So you have to use both why questions, and I've noticed an absence of why questions now. I see all of the seminars going on at our university and so on, and they're nearly all how questions. So until we can swing back, and I think it is a pendulum, because we know that science advances with good technology, and then technology advances with good science. So it's a pendulum, the two depend on each other. And what we've got to do now is swing it back to ask the question, and this is what's implied by what Stan said, is why are you doing that? What interesting questions will this sort of analysis help us to understand how the world works?
Amen, Tony. That's exactly right. And Stan, a comment, you're getting old.
Well, Rodolfo, do you have another question?
Okay.
Because I have. There's been a number of questions in the Facebook, and so I'd like to at least bring a couple of them into for people. There's a lot of questions in there, a lot of comments, and one of them is, I guess, we heard Charlie talk about the old theory of the equilibrium. And then we heard Tony talk about equilibrium too. And the question that it's on the Facebook, it says, do you think that conservationists should keep on talking about equilibrium on natural systems as a conservation goal when giving the talks and interviews that you have posted show that everything is just change?
Is the plan for them to respond to that now, Carlos?
Well, if you want to think about that, just to clarify what we mean with equilibrium when we talk about it.
Okay, Carlos, can I say something here?
Yes.
I think the fundamental problem is that people equate equilibrium with stability or stationarity. That is not correct.
That's good. All right, Rodolfo, you were going to ask a question.
Okay, but before I do that, I wanted to bring a historical fact which I think is interesting in the context of our discussion today. It was wonderful to see the names of some really crucial population dynamics people. Elton was mentioned, Varley and Gradwell were mentioned, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to say that the population biology of plants, which to my surprise took much longer to sort of develop and explode, did not take the lessons from the animal population ecologists until much later. But I think that the arithmetic that Charlie was talking about was taken by the plant ecologists, and you can see the tremendous difference that made for the development of plant biology in general terms, plant population ecology, plant evolutionary biology, evolutionary ecology, and so on and so forth. So that's an important historical factor that I wanted to bring to this celebration. My question is not very scientific now, and I can imagine that some, particularly some younger people with not so many white trichomes down here in the audience, who might be pondering about this kind of things. Given what we have been talking about, and Franz actually developed this issue, and you responded to that, which is that many things are going really, really bad in terms of conservation of nature, conservation of predators, conservation of populations or extinctions of populations, and the conservation of processes. What hope can younger generations have about studying population ecology, population biology, given the dramatic changes in the natural world, particularly seen from the point of view of animal populations?
Well, I'll take one stab. It's incredibly exciting because if you accept change is taking place and understanding the drivers of that change, which is population dynamics, there's a huge world out there for you to pursue interesting questions. If you are a conservation biologist at heart that is only concerned about the species you're interested in, then I think you feel doomed all of the time, because it's so depressing, because your population, your species goes down. But if you shift gears a bit to say, I'm interested in studying how those changes take place and why, and how we as humans can do things to change the way those things happen, it's incredibly exciting.
Thank you, Stan.
I think the other thing, Stan, you alluded to, and I think there's argument for it, is an interventionist approach as well. You know, Stan suggested that there's no way we can maintain the caribou populations unless we're interventionists with respect to the wolves. They will get the upper hand, and the caribou are not adapted to it. So I think if we want species to survive, Tony suggested that's impossible, perhaps in Africa, but if we want species to survive, we have to be interventionist. I'm thinking of narwhals and belugas in the Arctic and the killer whales moving in. From what I can see, those will disappear because of an extremely effective predator unless we're interventionist. So maybe that sort of principle applies in other areas. We have to be both proactive to save, identify the processes, and then do what we can.
Thank you.
All right. Well, maybe Ángela has another question. Where is Ángela? She's gone. She knew I was going to.
She left us.
She knew I was going to put her on the spot. Okay. Well, Mauricio.
Just talking about how do similar question that Jorge did in the second round. What the future? What the next why question in population dynamics, and are more applied or more theoretical? We have a theoretical holes to study yet, or population dynamics is in the future applied science, applied discipline to solve a specific or huge problem in conservation, biological control, epidemics, and fisheries, and as I said, maybe other areas outside of ecology.
Charlie.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and my bet would be that we should be doing more and more applied ecology, and that's the way ecologists, if you like, will make their contribution to the whole world. And Stan's already covered that very well, and I think the important thing here is that. We try to solve the problems of the world. So let's say, what are the problems? What are the problems? There's a problem now in Australia. They're having an outbreak of house mice in the wheat growing areas. It's a hell of a big problem. It's on the television, for God's sake. And yet there's almost no money devoted to this study of this. And so the solution is throw poison out there. And they throw poison by the ton, okay? So that's the solution. That's a crazy solution for the 21st century. So this is the kind of problem I think somebody needs to grab by the throat and say, here's a problem, here's an applied problem. Judy's already talked about biocontrol. There ought to be more and more money put into these kind of applied issues. I think it's not everything, of course, not everything in ecology has to be applied, but I think we really need to make a punch in the applied end of things.
Thank you, Charlie. And I guess we're winding down. Franz, I'd like to show a couple of slides before we end up. I also know that Charlie has to run to get his COVID vaccine. And so if you have another question, Franz.
Yeah, yes, Carlos, thank you. Just one last question, and just to reiterate about the possible future for population ecologists, and most of their activity is going to be on modified landscapes. It's going to be really difficult to look at the natural landscape like in Canada or the Serengeti, and we have more and more these human modified landscapes, and we are going to keep looking at these interactions. And one of the really nice things about learning from your experience is that you have set up a set of really good rules or interactions, the way that the populations are regulated in the environment. And my question is, we should anticipate major changes in these rules now that probably these new young scientists are going to be looking at these interactions in the future and these modified landscapes. And if so, could you give us a hint of what kind of modifications we should expect in terms of the rules that you have identified? Do you have an idea of what the future would be in terms of modifying this interaction with the human landscapes and these rules that you have detected through all these years?
So basically, what's your final word? Where are we going?
Where do we go from here?
Well, but again, I think Tony laid out just an elegant set of next steps. Is basically nothing's changed in terms of the basic ways the systems operate, but we have modified one of those basic elements. And so the challenge becomes figuring out, what did we modify, and can we in fact retool it to fit better with what our overall objectives are? But the basics of population ecology will still be there in spades, driving how we proceed as applied ecologists, it seems to me. The alternative, I think what you may be getting at is, will these completely modified landscapes create a new set of rules? And I'm not sure that they will. I don't know.
That was exactly my question. So basically, we have solid science.
So Stan and what you're saying is, if we have these modified landscapes, then and we get a different set of rules, we need to be able to see whether those sets of rules are resilient and stable in the long run. And again, so that brings me back to what I said before. So in one word, I would say you got to study the trophic cascade.
Okay.
I think we're going to be dealing with a lot more invasive species everywhere, and therefore interactions between those species and the native species. But I agree. I think the rules are going to be the same.
Same.
Okay. Ángela, you escaped before. Do you have any other question before we wrap up?
Sorry for leaving you. Something happened with the light in my apartment. Sorry, but I'm back. I have just maybe a very general question, but it's again some recommendations from you to how to study the cumulative effects of extreme weather changes in climate on population dynamics. Maybe focusing here in on the tropics.
It seems to me that's where we cannot escape using modeling approaches to get at these sorts of things, is that because we can't really subject larger areas to these extremes, and usually when they happen, everything is in such chaos that you really can't go in and study things very well. So I think you can still start with the basics, but then look at how the frequency of those extreme events might drive populations in one direction or another. I think it's going to be the frequency that's the issue, not the extremism of each of those events, but I don't know.
I think the other thing I would say is that these animals and plants are adapted within a limited frame of reference. And if you exceed that, or you're screwed. In other words, you can't predict, modeling will not predict that, because all adaptations are adaptations to an ecological problem. If the problem changes, the solution may not be there, or to the same extent. So actually being able to model it may be totally irrelevant, because the animal or plant they're not adapted to it, right? And so then they've got a real problem. It's like polar bears. They're screwed because the ice will disappear. It's over. So in other words, it depends on the nature and severity, and have they got something in their history to be evolved to deal with it. If they haven't, they've got problems, and we're not going to be able to predict it. Well, you can predict it, they're gone. So I think it's very difficult to model something outside their ecological history.
Charlie.
Just came to mind Joe Connell and the mob down in Australia studying the barrier reef, where you get these hurricanes, cyclones, and they knock the hell out of the reef, and then it recovers over a series of years. Again, a long-term study, and they got a whole lot of information for these sessile animals as well as the fish, how the recovery goes. And exactly Rudy's point, how frequent, and Tony's point, how frequent is there a disturbance? And then what happens when the disturbances get too frequent? So I think there's a good model system if you're looking for it, to say, what can you do? And you can't predict when a cyclone's coming, but you can look at the aftermath.
Carlos, I know that we have to wrap up, but I would like to highlight a general thing that I think we all learn, that Charlie started by saying that in the area of Satan, in the area of the devil is in the details. And one way of addressing the area of the devil, the details, is via natural history, and then long-term studies that generate general principles. And then those general principles combined with experimental manipulations, as we saw in many of the presentations, can be an exciting field that should get students excited going forward to address some of the critical issues that we face today, that biodiversity is facing today. And I want to thank you all for bringing all of those terrific insights in this set of presentations and responses today.
Thank you, Rodolfo. I think you are hitting right on the nail. I'd like to thank everyone for their seminars, their examples, in fact, for their live research, which is going to be an example and a motivation for many people to see how can you understand nature by posing questions, by doing experiments, and by following this long-term research. It's been a privilege for all of us to have the 5 of you presenting the seminars. I want to thank you again for your commitment I had the opportunity to enjoy you personally for many years. And I'm really, really glad that you could all participate. We got more than we bargained for. Thank you very much. I'd like to present just a couple of slides that I have here. See if they work now. There, I don't know, can you see them?
No, yes, yes.
Well, that's the Institute of Animal Resource Ecology, Hot B6, as it was many years ago when we all were at some point in there. And I'd like to thank you. We will send you a diploma that will thank for all these talks. They are all in digital, so you will receive them as soon as possible. And with that, it has been great. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rudy, Judy, Stan, and Tony. And thank you, the panel of great ecologists, Jorge, Mauricio, Ángela, Rodolfo, and Franz. Thank you very much for this great opportunity.
Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thanks to the panel, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Charlie.